On the morning of March 14th, 1889, Wei Chen pulled a rusted bolt from the underside of the Black Bear Bridge, crossing the Feather River, 47 miles north of Sacramento, and felt something wrong the instant the iron left the timber and settled into his palm. The bolt weighed almost nothing. He stood on the bridge deck with the morning freight scheduled in 11 minutes, and he turned the bolt over in his hand the way a man turns over something that does not belong in the world. Standard iron head, standard threading, standard diameter, 1.25 inches. Exactly regulation. Exactly what every inspector on the Central Pacific line would pass without a second glance. He pressed his thumbnail against the threaded end and pushed. The metal gave slightly, a fraction of a millimeter, the way iron does not give. He tapped it against the bridge rail. It rang hollow, a dry, brittle sound like a cracked church bell struck by a stone. A railroad cook had just found a confession. Wei Chen was 39 years old. He had worked the Central Pacific commissary car since 1878, cooking for 340 men per shift on a cast iron stove, bolted to a flat car. The stove so close to the car wall that his left elbow bore a permanent burn scar 4 inches wide from 11 years of winter crossings. He was not an engineer. He carried no credentials and held no license, and his name appeared in no Central Pacific personnel record as anything other than cook, Chinese, car 7. But in 1866, at 16 years old, Wei Chen had spiked track through the highest mountain crossing in North America, 1,400 feet above sea level, drilling blast holes by hand into solid granite using black powder, tamped with iron chisels. He had carried bolts in canvas sacks weighing 60 pounds across ice fields that killed 3 men in a single February week. He knew the weight of a bolt the way a blacksmith knows the color of hot iron, by feel, without thinking. This bolt felt like a lie. The Black Bear Bridge had stood since November 11th, 1869. It crossed 190 feet of open canyon above the Feather River at a height of 74 feet, carrying 14 passenger trains per day in both directions, plus daily freight. A total daily load the Central Pacific Engineering Office calculated at 1,100 tons of moving weight, distributed across 847 load-bearing bolts. The bridge had been inspected 4 times since construction. Each inspection returned a clean report. The most recent certification, signed by District Inspector Harold Fitch on January 4, 1889, 6 weeks before Wei Chen stood on its deck with a hollow bolt in his hand, listed all primary structural connections as sound, all anchor bolts within regulation tolerance. Fitch had spent 40 minutes on the bridge. Wei Chen had spent 11 years cooking on trains that crossed it twice a week at 35 miles per hour. He put the bolt in his coat pocket and said nothing. He walked back to the commissary car and stood at the stove for 20 minutes without moving. He watched the morning freight cross the Black Bear Bridge from the dining car window. 22 loaded timber cars, 480 tons. The bridge shuddering visibly through the canyon walls as the locomotive hit the center span. The shudder was normal. He had eaten breakfast watching that same shudder 300 times. He held the hollow bolt while the train completed its crossing. Then he put it in his apron pocket next to his knife and began cooking eggs for 340 men. He thought about what he knew about bolts. A hollow bolt is not an accident. Iron does not develop an internal cavity from rust or weather or age. Rust grows outward and adds surface. It does not excavate. To produce a hollow bolt requires a lathe, a drill bit, time, intention, and a very specific kind of anger. Wei Chen had seen a lathe. He had worked beside the foundry cars in the rail yard during the Sierra Crossing in 1867, when the lathe operators were Chinese men earning $26 per month for 12-hour days, while white workers doing equivalent labor earned $35 for 10-hour days. He remembered the year the lathe operators stopped coming to the foreman's morning count. He pressed his thumb into the hollow of the bolt and felt the thin iron wall. It took him until noon to understand what he was holding. The Chinese workers of the Central Pacific Railroad went on strike in June 1867. They sent a written list of demands to Superintendent Charles Crocker: equal wages, 10-hour workdays, and freedom from physical discipline by white foremen in the field. Crocker cut off their food supply and threatened to import workers from the South as replacements. The strike lasted 1 week. The workers returned to the track without a single concession granted. Crocker later published a statement calling the Chinese workers the best labor I ever had. He paid them $26 per month and considered the matter finished. Wei Chen's uncle had carried the written list of demands to Crocker's office and walked back to camp alone, the list still folded in his pocket, and spent the rest of that summer drilling blast holes in silence. It was not finished. A hollow bolt holds its shape under static load. This is the critical fact, the fact that makes it invisible for decades. Press down on a hollow bolt with a vertical weight, and it performs exactly like solid iron, compresses correctly, torques to specification, passes every inspector's gauge measuring outer diameter. But dynamic load is different. When a locomotive crosses a bridge at 35 miles per hour, vibration travels through the timber into the bolt at 12 to 18 cycles per second, depending on train weight and span length. Solid iron absorbs that frequency. Hollow iron flexes, a movement too small to see or feel standing on the bridge deck, but measurable with the right instruments. A flex that widens the bolt hole by 0.003 inches per 10,000 crossings. The Black Bear Bridge had completed approximately 85,000 crossings since 1869. Wei Chen did the math twice while peeling potatoes. He got the same number both times. That night, Wei Chen borrowed a screwdriver from the rail yard toolbox at Oroville Station and walked back to the Black Bear Bridge in the dark. He carried his commissary lantern, a tin cup of cold coffee, and his uncle's method for finding hollow rock before setting a blast charge. Tap the surface. Listen for the difference between the ring of solid stone and the dead flat knock of empty space behind it. He crawled under the bridge at 9:40 p.m. The temperature over the Feather River Canyon dropped to 31 degrees. The river moved 74 feet below him, black and fast, loud enough that he pressed his ear directly against the iron to hear the tap over the water noise. He worked his way along the first section. Solid, 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 hollow, solid. He was not surprised. He moved from the southern anchor plate toward the center span with methodical patience. 23 solid bolts in the first section, 4 hollow, 7 solid, 3 hollow, then a run of 11 hollow bolts in unbroken sequence along the primary load-bearing truss. Wei Chen paused at the 11th. He laid his palm flat against the truss iron and held it there. At this exact point in the structure, every pound of every train that crossed this bridge transferred its full dynamic weight through this brace to the canyon wall anchors. The hollow bolts were not scattered randomly. They were concentrated specifically and precisely at the maximum stress point. He did not need an engineering degree to understand this. He needed only 23 years of feeling where the shudder was strongest when a locomotive hit the center span. This was not sabotage born of rage. This was sabotage born of precision. His fingers stopped bending correctly at bolt 34. He lay on his back against the truss brace, 74 feet above the water, with the lantern burning low and 34 hollow bolts arranged in a line across his chest, because he needed to see them together. They should have weighed 8.5 pounds combined. They weighed closer to 3.2. A deficit of 5.3 pounds of missing iron distributed across the primary structure of a bridge that 1,100 tons of passenger trains crossed every single day. He could feel the river vibration through the truss iron against his spine. The lantern threw shadows across the bolt line on his chest. He did not move for 6 minutes. At 11:20 p.m., Wei Chen climbed back onto the bridge deck and sat on the rail with the bolts in his coat pocket and pulled out his meal notebook. He wrote in Chinese because it was faster and because no one on the Central Pacific payroll could read it. He documented bolt positions from memory, cross-referencing his tap test results against his mental map of the bridge structure. 34 hollow bolts, covering 19% of the primary truss connection points. He did not know yet how many other bridges on this line had been similarly prepared. He did not know that the men who installed these bolts had kept their own records. He did not know that those records existed in a tin box buried under a specific floorboard in a specific building, 12 miles from where he was sitting. He knew only what he had in his pocket right now. He took the passenger schedule from his apron and read it under the lantern. 3 trains, dawn to mid-morning. The first one due in 4 hours and 40 minutes. He had no way to stop them. Wei Chen sat on the bridge rail for 3 minutes and 16 seconds. He counted before he stood up and put the passenger schedule back in his apron pocket. The first train crossed the Black Bear Bridge at 5:40 a.m. It was now 11:38 p.m. He had 5 hours and 2 minutes. The station at Oroville was 4 miles south on foot, and the station master's name was Gerald Pratt. And Wei Chen had served Gerald Pratt breakfast on Car 7 for 9 years. And he knew exactly what Gerald Pratt would say when a Chinese cook arrived at his window before midnight, carrying a pocket full of iron bolts and a claim about structural failure. He picked up his lantern and walked north, away from Oroville, away from the station, toward a building he had been told about once, 11 years ago, by a man he had not thought about since. The man's name was Liang Fushin, lathe operator, Sierra Nevada Crossing, 1865 to 1869. In the summer of 1878, Liang Fushin had found Wei Chen at the Oroville rail yard, sat down across from him without being invited, and said something Wei Chen had dismissed at the time as the speech of a man who had been drinking. He had not been drinking. That the men who built Black Bear Bridge and 7 other canyon crossings had not built them to last. They had built them to appear to last. That real records existed, kept by the men who did the work, in a former supply depot 12 miles north. Milepost 247 loose floorboard in the northeast corner under the second window from the door. He said, "One day you will need to know this." Wei Chen had walked away from that conversation and not thought seriously about it for 11 years. He was thinking about it now with a clarity that felt physical, like cold water across the back of the neck. He walked 12 miles on an unlit road in 29-degree air, the lantern burning its last oil at mile 9 and leaving him to finish in full dark by feel and the sound of the river to his left. The abandoned depot appeared at mile 12 as a black rectangle against a sky just beginning to separate from dark. He estimated 1:15 a.m. when he pushed the door from its frame and stepped inside. He had 3 hours and 45 minutes before the first train. The northeast corner, second window from the door. The floorboard was distinguished from the surrounding planks only by 2 details: nails slightly newer than the rest, and the near edge slightly cleaner, as though it had been lifted and replaced multiple times. Wei Chen found the edge, applied pressure at the center, and the board pivoted up. Beneath it, a tin box, 8 inches by 5 inches by 3 inches, sealed with a lead clasp and wrapped in oilcloth. He lifted it and set it on the floor beside him. The tin was cold, slightly damp, and heavier than he expected. Inside, paper. The first document was a hand-drawn map of the Central Pacific Line from Sacramento to Reno, 189 miles, with 23 locations marked in red ink. The Black Bear Bridge was marked. 22 others were marked beside it: the Cape Horn Viaduct, the Secret Town Trestle, the American River Crossing, 19 more. Each location carried a number in a small, precise hand. Wei Chen traced his finger along the line. His lips moved but made no sound. The numbers were hollow bolt counts. Black Bear Bridge, 34. Cape Horn, 67. Secret Town Trestle, 112. American River, 89. Wei Chen added them in his head by groups of 5, checking twice, the way he counted meal portions. The total across all 23 sites, 1,409 hollow bolts. He looked at the map and understood, without yet reading the other 13 documents, that this was one segment, Sacramento to Reno, 189 miles. The Central Pacific Line ran 1,776 miles total. This was one segment. The second document was an undated letter, written to no one. It read, "These modifications were completed between April 1867 and November 1869 by workers whose names appear on the attached list. They were made in response to the non-payment of agreed wages for the period January 1866 through June 1867, representing a total debt of $214,000 owed to 12,000 workers and never settled. The men who made them understood the engineering. They also understood that the company would rather pay for inspections that found nothing than pay the men who built the line what it owed them." Wei Chen read it 3 times. The attached list named 47 men. His uncle, Chen Baolin, lathe operator, employed February 1865 through December 1869, was number 19. His uncle had died in 1881. He had never spoken of the bolts. He had cooked the same pot of rice for 40 years and called it an honest life. Wei Chen folded the list carefully along its original crease lines and placed it back in the tin. He had not known his uncle at all. The 13th document was different. Heavier stock, darker ink, a formal and practiced hand. An internal memorandum of the Central Pacific Railroad Company. dated August 3rd, 1872, from District Engineer Thomas Halley to Vice President Collis Huntington. It described the Cape Horn Viaduct maintenance inspection. It described finding 67 bolts with anomalous interior profiles. It described core sampling of 3 bolts that confirmed deliberate interior drilling to 2.4 inches depth. It described, in the careful language of an engineer writing to a very powerful man about something both already understood, a recommendation for full bolt replacement across all affected structures. Estimated cost, $340,000. Estimated repair timeline, 18 months. Disclosure risk, significant if source of modification becomes known. Then a handwritten annotation in the margin, red ink, 2 words. Not now. Below those 2 words, a signature, Collis Huntington, VP, Central Pacific Railroad, August 9th, 1872. 17 years before Wei Chen sat on the floor of an abandoned depot holding that document with the first passenger train 4 miles south, due to depart Oroville Station in 1 hour and 48 minutes. Central Pacific had known, not suspected known, with core samples and cost estimates, for 17 years. They had chosen disclosure risk over $340,000 in repairs. They had sent Harold Fitch to sign a clean inspection in January of this year and called it maintenance. Wei Chen placed the Huntington memorandum on top and closed the tin and held it on his knees with both hands. Outside, birds. First light. He stood up. He was 12 miles from Oroville, 1 hour and 43 minutes from the first train, and he was a Chinese cook whose name appeared in no Central Pacific record as anything other than Cook Chinese Car 7 inches, and he was holding a tin box that proved the company had known for 17 years that its bridges might kill its passengers and had decided the price of disclosure was too high. He tucked the box under his arm. He stepped out onto the road and turned south and began walking. At 40 feet, he stopped. A lantern light burned on the road south, stationary a quarter mile out, orange and still in the gray dawn air. Not moving toward him, not moving away, just burning in the precise direction he needed to walk. Someone was waiting. Wei Chen stood on the road for 11 seconds, counting his own heartbeats the way he counted bolt taps under the bridge. Not from calm, but because counting was the only way he knew to hold still when his body wanted to move. The lantern a quarter mile south did not move. It hung at chest height, steady in the pre-dawn air the way a lantern hangs when a man holds it deliberately, not when a man carries it walking. The road between them was flat and open, no cover, 200 feet of nothing before the first bend. The river on his left and a granite slope on his right. He pressed the tin box against his side under his coat. He counted to 11, stopped counting, and walked toward the light. He pulled the tin box from under his coat at 80 feet from the lantern, pressed it into a gap between 2 granite boulders at knee height, and covered the gap with his coat arranged over the rock face. The gap was 4 inches wide and 14 inches deep, and the tin fit exactly. He memorized the boulder by shape, a long flat face with a diagonal crack running upper left toward center. Walked back onto the road, put his hands in his apron pockets. He arrived at the lantern. The man holding it was white, approximately 50 years old, sitting on a mile marker stone with his elbows on his knees, and an expression Wei Chen recognized immediately. The expression of a man who has been waiting much longer than he expected to wait. He looked at Wei Chen for 2 full seconds. "You were under the bridge last night," he said. Not a question. He set the lantern in the dirt between them and rubbed his hand on his coat leg, the way a man rubs a hand that has been gripping something cold for hours. His name, he said, was James Corrigan. James Corrigan had been a Central Pacific structural engineer from 1871 to 1887, 16 years, the last 4 as senior inspector for the Northern California segment, the man whose signature appeared on bridge certification reports for the exact territory Wei Chen had spent the night crawling under. In November 1887, Corrigan filed an internal report documenting anomalous deflection patterns in 3 Feather River Canyon bridges under dynamic load: the Black Bear Crossing, the Pulga Narrows Span, the Rich Bar Trestle. The report recommended immediate physical inspection of all load-bearing bolt connections at all 3 sites. It came back 9 days later marked reviewed and closed. The deflection variations deemed within acceptable parameters for timber frame construction of that era. Corrigan resubmitted with a technical addendum. He was dismissed 2 weeks later. "I saw your lantern at 10:04 p.m., Corrigan said. "I waited because I needed to know what you found before I decided what to do about you." Wei Chen looked at the mile marker Corrigan sat on. Mile 247. The same number Liang Fushin had spoken 11 years ago in a rail yard in Oroville. He looked back at Corrigan's face and made a decision in approximately 4 seconds. "I found 34 hollow bolts," Wei Chen said. "Primary truss, concentrated at maximum load points." Corrigan pressed his thumb and forefinger against the bridge of his nose and held them there. He said, "I counted 31 in 1887. 3 bolts had been added between Corrigan's dismissed report and tonight. Someone had continued the work after the company declared the matter closed. 3 additional hollow bolts on the same truss as a response, or as a statement, or as both." Wei Chen held the implication of this without speaking it aloud. Corrigan pulled a hand-drawn diagram from his coat pocket. The Black Bear Bridge truss system, annotated in pencil, 31 numbered circles at bolt positions. Wei Chen looked at the diagram and identified the 3 positions not present on it without touching the paper. He pointed with one finger. Corrigan looked where Wei Chen pointed. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "There are 23 bridges on this segment," Wei Chen said. He did not say yet how he knew. "I know of 7, Corrigan said. "How do you know 23? Wei Chen looked north toward the boulder where the tin box sat in the darkness. He had 1 hour and 19 minutes before the first train. He had no way to stop it by running. 12 miles back to Oroville at a viable pace was a number that did not work. The only telegraph between here and Oroville was at Pulga Station, 3 miles north, operated by Howard Sims, a Central Pacific employee since 1881, whose continued employment depended entirely on the goodwill of the company, whose documents Wei Chen had just read in an abandoned depot in the dark. He told Corrigan about the tin box in 90 seconds, speaking the way he read supply inventories. Fast, precise, no adjectives. Corrigan stood up. They retrieved the tin box together. Wei Chen handed Corrigan the Huntington Memorandum first, the document with the signature and the date, the one that answered everything, and watched him tilt it toward the lantern light, and read it with his lips pressed together, and the muscles at the hinges of his jaw working visibly. Corrigan read it twice. He turned it over and looked at the blank back as though something on the reverse might explain it differently. There was nothing on the reverse. He turned it back over. August 1872, Corrigan said. Huntington knew in August 1872. He lowered the document. I filed my report in 1887, 15 years after this. They sent it back reviewed and closed. His voice stayed level, but his hand holding the memorandum carried a fine tremor visible in the lantern light. They had a memorandum from their own vice president confirming deliberate structural modification, with engineering analysis and a repair cost estimate. They had it in their files. They sent my report back, reviewed and closed. He set the memorandum across the tin box. He said nothing else for 30 seconds. Then he said, "How long to Pulga?" 3 miles north. 41 minutes at their current pace. 41 minutes to a telegraph station controlled by a company employee to send a message asking that company to stop its own trains on a bridge it had known was compromised since 1872, carrying documents proving it had buried that knowledge for 17 years. Wei Chen looked at Corrigan. Corrigan looked at Wei Chen. Every reason this would not work passed between them without being spoken. Every reason they had to do it anyway followed immediately after. They started walking. Fast. 2 miles north, the road rose above river level, and the canyon opened enough to see the track line curving south in the gray early light. The twin rails running parallel and shrinking toward the Black Bear Bridge, crossing 2 miles distant. The bridge looked exactly as it always looked. Solid, maintained, certified. Exactly what Harold Fitch had signed his name to 6 weeks ago. Wei Chen looked at it for 4 seconds. He could see nothing wrong from here. That was the entire problem. He had walked another 1/4 mile north when he heard it. Thin, high, unmistakably clear in the canyon air. The approach whistle of the 5:40 a.m. out of Oroville, still several miles south, but moving, running on time, carrying sleeping passengers through the canyon at 35 miles per hour toward a primary truss, held in part by 34 hollow bolts that Collis Huntington had known about since August 1872 and chosen not to fix. Approximately 8 miles south, 13 minutes and 40 seconds from the bridge. Pulga Station still a full mile ahead. Wei Chen looked at Corrigan. Corrigan was already running. The key. The last mile to Pulga Station was uphill for the first quarter, then flat, then downhill to the river bend, where the station sat against the canyon wall. A single-room timber building, 14 feet by 20 feet, with a covered platform facing the tracks and a stovepipe at the roof peak that leaked smoke in cold mornings when the operator lit the stove before dawn. Wei Chen had eaten breakfast on the platform 3 times in 11 years when Car 7 stopped for water at the Pulga tank. He knew the building. He did not know if Howard Sims slept inside or in the adjacent bunkhouse 40 feet north. He ran and calculated simultaneously. The whistle had come from approximately 8 miles south, the train running at 35 miles per hour, which meant 13 minutes and 40 seconds from the first whistle to the bridge. He had heard the whistle at least 90 seconds ago. He had 12 minutes and 10 seconds, maybe less, and the station was still a half mile ahead, and Corrigan, 16 years older and running in leather-soled boots on loose gravel, was 20 feet behind and closing the gap in the downhill section. Neither of them spoke a word. Howard Sims was awake. The light in the station window was already burning at low orange when Wei Chen hit the platform steps. Not lamplight, stove light. The particular amber that comes through a single pane of glass when a man has his morning fire started and nothing else lit yet. Wei Chen did not knock. He pressed the door handle and pushed and stepped into a room that smelled of pine smoke, cold coffee, and the specific mechanical oil smell of telegraph equipment. A brass and iron smell, faintly sharp, like a tool chest left open. Sims was at his desk, 34 years old, red-haired, in suspenders over a union suit, holding a cup with both hands and looking at Wei Chen with the expression of a man who has not yet decided whether what he is seeing is real. He set down the cup. "Station's closed until 6, Sims said in the automatic voice of a man reciting a rule before his mind has processed what his eyes are looking at. Corrigan came through the door behind Wei Chen, breathing hard, and Sims's expression shifted from automatic refusal to something more complicated. He knew Corrigan. That was evident in the 1.5 seconds it took Sims to recognize him. The way the shoulders pulled slightly back and the jaw moved without producing words. The body's response to seeing someone who represents an unresolved problem. "Mr. Corrigan," Sims said. Corrigan put both hands flat on the desk surface and leaned forward and said, "Send a stop order to Sacramento Dispatch, Black Bear Bridge. Tell them structural emergency. Hold all southbound traffic north of Oroville." He said it the way an engineer states a specification, not asking, not demanding, stating the factual content of what needed to happen. Sims did not move. "I can't send a stop order on a bridge that passed inspection in January," Sims said, "on the word of a..." He stopped. He looked at Wei Chen. He finished his sentence in a different direction. "On the word of 2 men arriving at my door at 5 in the morning without any documentation of a structural problem." Wei Chen opened his coat. He set the tin box on the desk beside Sims's cup. He opened it and lifted out the Huntington memorandum and placed it flat on the desk directly in front of Sims, face up, and turned it 180 degrees so it read correctly from Sims's side. Sims looked down. He read the header. He looked up at the 2 men standing on the other side of his own desk in his own station at 5:42 in the morning. He looked back down at the memorandum. He read it fully, which took 90 seconds, and Wei Chen counted every one of them. Outside, the whistle again. Closer. The second whistle came from the south at a register noticeably higher than the first. A sound that fills canyon walls differently at 4 miles than at 8. A higher, harder sound that the canyon rock returns to you with an edge on it. Sims heard it. He placed one finger on the Huntington memorandum and held it there, not pointing at any specific word, simply making contact with the paper, as though confirming it was real and physical and present on his desk. August 3rd, 1872. Thomas Halley to Collis Huntington. Core samples. Hollow bolt confirmation. Recommended repair. $340,000. Not now. 17 years old, the signature beneath it still clean and dark on paper that had spent those 17 years sealed in oilcloth in a tin box under a floorboard 3 miles from where Howard Sims sat in his union suit with his finger on it at 5:42 a.m. on March 15th, 1889. He pulled his hand back. He reached for his telegraph key. He began to transmit. The key was a standard railroad issue Morse instrument. Brass lever, ivory knob. the kind Wei Chen had heard ticking through station walls hundreds of times without ever needing to understand what it said. Sims worked it with the practiced, involuntary speed of a man who has operated the same instrument for 8 years without thinking about finger placement. Dot dash dash dot dot dot. The rhythmic mechanical sound filling the small room over the stove noise and the river outside. And Wei Chen stood with the tin box under his arm and watched Sims's hand on the key and listened to the train whistle come again from the south. 3 miles now, the sound arriving before he expected it, and lasting longer than it should in the canyon. Corrigan moved to the south-facing window. He put his hand flat on the cold glass and looked down the track line toward the curve that hid the Black Bear Bridge from view. He stayed at the window. Sims finished transmitting and lifted his hand and waited. The receiver began ticking almost immediately. The Sacramento night operator still on shift, acknowledging receipt. Corrigan did not turn from the window. Sims read the acknowledgement aloud without being asked. Received. Stop order processing. Estimated relay to Oroville Station 2 to 3 minutes. Wei Chen calculated 2 to 3 minutes for the stop order to reach Oroville Dispatch, where the 540 southbound had already departed. The departure board at Oroville was 4 miles south of the station and 8 miles from the bridge. The train had been running since before Corrigan and Wei Chen reached Pulga. It had already passed the departure board. A stop order issued now would not reach the locomotive engineer before the train reached the bridge. Wei Chen looked at Corrigan's back at the window. Corrigan knew this too. 9 minutes elapsed. They passed in the way that certain minutes pass. Not quickly, not slowly, but with an abnormal texture, each second distinguishable from the previous one. The way you can feel individual heartbeats when your pulse is elevated. Sims sat at his desk with his hands flat on the surface and did not speak. Corrigan stayed at the south window. Wei Chen stood in the center of the room with the tin box and watched the stovepipe and listened to the river and the growing high sound from the south, and did not move his feet. At 5:48 a.m., exactly, Wei Chen read the station clock on the wall, a Seth Thomas regulator, black numerals on white enamel, the second hand completing its sweep at the same moment. The sound from the south changed quality. It did not become louder. It became different. The specific layered sound of a locomotive crossing open timber. The rhythmic knock of iron wheels on rail joints accelerating through the resonant frequency of a 190-foot trestle span over a canyon. The train was on the bridge. Wei Chen counted. A 190-foot bridge crossing at 35 miles per hour takes approximately 3.7 seconds, plus the length of the train itself. 11 cars by the passenger manifest Corrigan had memorized, including the locomotive and tender. A total train length of approximately 620 feet. 810 feet of train at 35 miles per hour. 15.8 seconds. He counted from the first timber knock sound to the last. He counted 14 seconds, 15, 16. The canyon sound shifted again. The hollow trestle resonance replaced by the solid earthwork sound of a train on grade, pulling away south on the far side of the crossing. Sims released a breath through his nose that was not quite a sound, but that moved the papers on his desk slightly. Corrigan lowered his hand from the window glass. The Black Bear Bridge stood. The 5:40 a.m. out of Oroville had crossed it at 1,100 tons at 35 miles per hour. over 34 hollow bolts in the primary truss, and the bridge had held. Today, Corrigan said aloud, the single word, as though he had heard Wei Chen's thought. Still looking south through the window at the empty track and the empty canyon and the bridge they could not see from here, but that was still standing. For now, for this morning, for this one crossing of this one train. The next train is at 7:15, Wei Chen said. Then the 9:40, then the freight at noon. Corrigan turned from the window. Sims was still sitting at his desk, both hands flat on the surface, the Huntington memorandum between his hands, looking at it with the expression of a man who has understood something he cannot ununderstand. What do I do with this? Sims said, meaning the memorandum, meaning the tin box, meaning this entire morning that had arrived at his door in the dark, before his coffee was ready. Wei Chen closed the tin box and held it against his chest. 23 bridges, 1,409 hollow bolts on the Sacramento to Reno segment alone. A company vice president's signature on a memorandum confirming knowledge and directing silence. 14 trains per day on the Black Bear Bridge alone. 17 years. This was not a question Wei Chen could answer in a telegraph station before breakfast. Corrigan picked up the Huntington memorandum and folded it carefully along its original lines and held it in his hand. This goes to a federal court, Corrigan said, not a railroad court, not a state commission that takes Central Pacific money. A federal court in San Francisco filed by a licensed attorney, with a certified copy sent to the Associated Press office on Market Street, simultaneously, so that the company cannot suppress the filing before the press has it. He looked at Sims. That starts today, this morning. Sims looked at the memorandum in Corrigan's hand, and then at the telegraph key on his desk, and then at the wall to his left, where the Central Pacific direct line telephone instrument hung in its wooden cradle, a wall-mounted telephone connected by private wire to the company's regional office in Sacramento, installed at Pulga in 1887 for emergency line communication, used on average twice per month. They all looked at it. It was ringing. The bell mechanism struck 3 times, paused, struck twice more. The company's standard internal alert pattern, used when Sacramento needed to reach a station outside of normal dispatch hours. 5:51 a.m. Pulga Station. March 15th, 1889. The Huntington memorandum in Corrigan's hand. The tin box in Wei Chen's arms. Howard Sims between his desk and his telephone, with the expression of a man standing at a fork in a road at the exact moment a storm arrives, and understanding with complete clarity that regardless of which direction he chooses, he is going to get wet. The telephone bell struck twice more. Sims's hand moved toward the receiver. Wei Chen put his hand on Sims's arm. The watcher, on the rim. Wei Chen held his hand on Sims's arm for 3 seconds, not gripping, just resting, the way you rest a hand on something you want to remain still. The telephone bell struck once more and stopped. The silence that replaced it was not the same as the silence before it had rung. It was heavier, directional. The silence of something that had reached out from Sacramento and touched the room, and was now waiting on the other end of a wire to find out what the room would do next. Sims looked at Wei Chen's hand on his arm with the expression of a man who has been given very clear instructions by a very confusing situation. The fire snapped in the stove. The Seth Thomas on the wall read 5:53 a.m. Wei Chen removed his hand. He asked Sims one question. Who else works this canyon section? Sims turned the question over before answering visibly, the way a man turns over a question that has more weight than it shows. Day shift inspector runs the Feather River line Tuesdays and Fridays, he said. Maintenance crew, 4 men. They're based at Oroville. Only come up on call. There's no regular night staff. He paused. He was a man who understood that his next sentence mattered, but who hadn't yet decided if he trusted the 2 people in the room enough to speak it. He spoke it. There is a canyon watchman. Company hired him last fall. Lives in a survey shack at Ridge Point, 200 feet above the Black Bear Crossing. He has a field telephone direct to Sacramento dispatch. Wei Chen looked at Corrigan. Corrigan looked at the wall-mounted telephone instrument. They understood simultaneously. A canyon watchman at Ridge Point, 200 feet above the Black Bear Bridge, with a direct telephone line to Sacramento dispatch, had an unobstructed sight line into the canyon below and a direct wire with which to report what he saw in that canyon. Wei Chen had crawled under the Black Bear Bridge at 9:40 p.m. with a kerosene lantern burning at full wick, a light source generating approximately 12 candle power, visible in open dark terrain at a minimum range of 400 feet, and its significant range in a canyon where reflective water amplified light scatter. The watchman's shack at Ridge Point was 200 feet above the bridge and 150 feet laterally from the trestle center, placing it within a direct sight line of the entire understructure. Wei Chen had carried a lit lantern under the bridge for 1 hour and 22 minutes. He had not been invisible for a single moment of it. Corrigan moved first. He crossed the room to the station door in 4 strides and opened it and stepped onto the platform and stood there in the early morning light, looking south down the canyon road. The same road Wei Chen and he had run up 40 minutes ago. Empty gray gravel in the thin pre-dawn. No movement visible. He came back inside. How long does it take to get a man from Oroville to Pulga by horseback? He asked Sims. 40 minutes. Maybe less if they push it, Sims said. He was sitting very still at his desk, both hands visible on the surface. The Huntington memorandum no longer in front of him because Corrigan had taken it. Corrigan looked at the wall clock. 5:56 a.m. The watchman at Ridge Point had a direct line to Sacramento. The canyon watchman had seen the lantern under the bridge no later than 10 p.m., possibly earlier. That was 7 hours and 56 minutes ago. The math was not encouraging. The watchman calls Sacramento at 10 p.m., Corrigan said, standing in the center of the room and speaking the logic of it aloud, because logic spoken aloud sometimes contains an error that logic held silently does not. Sacramento calls Oroville. Oroville sends a rider, 40 minutes from Oroville to Pulga. That rider should have arrived here by 11 o'clock last night. He stopped. He looked at Sims. Did anyone come to this station last night? Sims met his eyes. A pause of approximately 4 seconds, which was, in the context of the morning they were all 3 having, a very long pause. A man came at 11:15, Sims said. Company identification. He asked if I'd seen anything unusual on the line. I told him no. Another pause. He went north, on foot, toward the milepost 247 area. Wei Chen set the tin box on Sims's desk. He set it down carefully. Milepost 247. The abandoned supply depot. The board in the northeast corner. Second window from the door. The man from the company had gone north on foot at 11:15 toward the exact location where the tin box had been buried for 20 years, and Wei Chen had arrived at that depot at approximately 1:15 in the morning and found the tin box untouched. 2 hours separated those events. 2 hours in which a company agent had walked in the direction of the depot and either failed to find it or found it empty because he was looking for the wrong thing or had not yet reached it. Wei Chen thought about his coat, draped across the boulders at roadside 40 feet north of the depot to cover the gap where he had hidden the tin box on his return walk south. A coat left on a rock on a road at night is nothing. A coat on a rock on a road at night, on the same night a company agent is searching that road, is a marker. Wei Chen picked up the tin box. They needed to leave. "There's a northbound freight at 6:40, Sims said. He said it without being asked. The information offered in the particular way a man offers information when he has made a decision he has not yet announced. It stops at Pulga for water, 12 minutes. It runs north to Reno. If you need to be somewhere that is not on this road by 7 this morning." He stopped. He looked at the wall telephone. He looked at Corrigan. "I didn't answer it," he said, meaning the 551 call from Sacramento. "When they call again, I'll tell them the line had interference. I can give it interference." He gestured at the telegraph equipment on his desk, a collection of components that a man familiar with them could introduce a grounding fault into for a plausible period of time before it became a reportable malfunction. Corrigan looked at him for a long moment. "The northbound crosses Black Bear," Corrigan said. Wei Chen had calculated this already. The northbound freight from Oroville ran the same track as the southbound passenger. Across the Black Bear Bridge, 190 feet of timber trestle, 74 feet above the Feather River, the same 847 load-bearing bolt connections, the same 34 hollow bolts in the primary truss. He had watched the 540 southbound cross it 12 minutes ago and heard the bridge hold and felt something that was not quite relief because the 715 was still coming and the 940 after it and the noon freight after that and every train that crossed it until the bolt connections widened past their last recoverable tolerance and the bridge stopped holding, which would happen on a specific morning at a specific speed with a specific load, and no one on the train would know which morning it was until it was already happening. "Yes," Wei Chen said. "The northbound crosses Black Bear." He stood with the tin box under his arm in the middle of a 14 by 20 foot room with a fire in the stove and a telephone on the wall that Sacramento was preparing to call again, and a clock reading 5:59 a.m. He was on the bridge at 6:40 or he was not. He told Corrigan in 45 seconds. The northbound freight stopped at Pulga for 12 minutes of water. That was 12 minutes in which 2 men could walk 400 feet to the freight platform and board the northbound going north. Away from Sacramento, away from Oroville, away from whoever the company was sending up the canyon road this morning. Or 12 minutes in which 2 men could walk in the other direction, south, back to where the road ran alongside the trestle approach, and make themselves visible on the bridge at 6:40 when the northbound was crossing it, visible to the locomotive engineer, creating a situation in which a train could not complete its crossing without witnesses, a situation that required the company to either acknowledge there were people on the bridge or to proceed as though the bridge were standard with 34 hollow bolts, with 2 people standing on it, described in Corrigan's handwriting, in a document submitted to federal court with every specific detail intact. Corrigan looked at Wei Chen for a long time. "You want to stand on the bridge?" Corrigan said. "Yes," Wei Chen said. Sims stood up from his desk. He stood up in the way that a man stands up when he has been sitting through a decision he could not make, but which has now been made by the people in the room without asking him. And he stands up because sitting is no longer the correct physical response to the situation. He crossed to the station filing cabinet against the north wall and opened the bottom drawer and took out a logbook, a standard Central Pacific station log, dark green cover, the station number stamped on the binding, and opened it to the current date page and wrote in it for approximately 20 seconds, then closed it and put it back in the drawer. "I logged the stop order transmission at 5:43 a.m., he said, with the text of the Huntington Memorandum transcribed as the basis for the order. He closed the drawer. "That log goes to Sacramento on the weekly freight, in a locked pouch that only the regional office opens." He looked at Corrigan. "You're not the only copy." Corrigan placed the Huntington Memorandum flat on the desk surface. He pointed to the station stamp on the equipment housing above the telegraph key. "Make a second transcription," he said. "Now." Sims worked the transcription in 11 minutes. The Huntington Memorandum reproduced in his own handwriting on 2 sheets of station letterhead. The text identical. Sims's hand steady and his lettering precise. The practiced neatness of a man who had filled out official forms for 8 years. He signed both copies, dated them, and stamped them with the Polga Station instrument stamp, which left a legally identifiable ink impression registered with the Central Pacific Records Office in Sacramento, and therefore with any court that subpoenaed those records. He folded one copy and gave it to Corrigan. He put the other in the log drawer. The clock read 6:11 a.m. Wei Chen had 29 minutes before the northbound arrived. Corrigan had the Huntington Memorandum and its certified transcription in his coat pocket. Wei Chen had the original documents in the tin box under his arm. Sims stood at his desk and said nothing and looked at the wall telephone, which had not rung again. The silence of it not ringing was its own kind of pressure. They left the station at 6:12 a.m. The road south was empty. No rider from Oroville. No company agent visible in either direction on the gravel road that ran between the river and the canyon wall. They walked at a pace just under a run, the tin box under Wei Chen's left arm. Corrigan's boots, loud on the gravel in the early morning quiet, the river running cold and fast to the right. At one point, 3 miles south, the road came closest to the trestle approach, a point where the timber framework of the bridge became visible at grade level, the beginning of its span extending out over the canyon, the far end of it disappearing into shadow against the far wall. Wei Chen stopped at this point. He looked at the bridge for a long moment, the way you look at something you have been thinking about for many hours and are now seeing in daylight for the first time. He turned to Corrigan. "When the northbound reaches the bridge," he said, "the engineer will see 2 men on the approach timber. He will stop or he will not stop." Corrigan looked at the bridge. He looked at Wei Chen. He looked at the bridge again. Then he stepped onto the approach timber first. The approach. They stood on the approach timber of the Black Bear Bridge at 6:31 a.m. in a light that had resolved, in the 9 minutes since they left the road, from pale gray into something closer to actual morning, a thin, cold light that came off the canyon walls at a low angle and made the river 74 feet below them look silver and very fast. The approach timber was a raised walkway beside the primary track, 18 inches wide, running parallel to the rail from the earthwork embankment to the first trestle bent, a distance of approximately 22 feet between where they stood and where the open frame trestle began and the canyon dropped away beneath. Wei Chen set the tin box on the timber at his feet and placed both hands in his apron pockets and looked north up the canyon where the track curved out of sight at a quarter mile. Corrigan stood beside him with his hands in his coat pockets and said nothing. The river was very loud from here. They could feel it in the soles of their boots. The northbound freight from Oroville had left the yard at 6:15 a.m. Wei Chen knew the departure time because it was on the schedule he had memorized from Sims's station board, the same schedule he had read at 11:23 p.m., looking for the passenger trains, which felt now like it had happened in a different week, rather than 7 hours ago. The northbound ran the Feather River Canyon at a standard freight pace, 28 miles per hour on the flat approaches, slowing to 22 through the canyon curves. Pulga Station was 3 miles north of the Black Bear crossing. At 22 miles per hour from Pulga, 8.2 minutes. They had been standing on the approach timber for 9 minutes. Corrigan looked north up the track. "It's running late," he said. 12-minute water stop at Pulga extended to 14, Wei Chen said. "Sims." Corrigan looked at him. Sims gave them 2 extra minutes. Corrigan nodded once. They heard it before they saw it. First, a change in the quality of sound in the canyon. A low register thickening of the air, distinct from the river noise. A sound that had no single direction because the canyon walls returned it from 3 sides simultaneously. Then the rail itself, a vibration that moved up through the approach timber into the soles of Wei Chen's feet at a frequency lower and steadier than the wind. A vibration that said iron on iron at distance, weight in motion, something very heavy coming around the curve at 22 miles per hour. Then the smoke, a gray-white column appearing above the canyon wall at the curve, before the locomotive itself appeared. The smoke arriving ahead of the engine the way a man's shadow arrives ahead of the man when the light is behind him. Wei Chen picked up the tin box. He held it with both hands in front of him. He did not step back. Corrigan did not step back. The locomotive came around the north curve of the canyon at 6:42 a.m. and 40 seconds, and it was larger than it looked from the dining car window of a moving train. A Baldwin 460, 98,000 pounds, black iron, the headlamp burning in the morning shadow of the canyon wall, throwing a cone of pale light down the track ahead of it. The engineer saw them at approximately 300 feet. Wei Chen watched the headlamp light cross them and stop moving. The moment a man's eyes lock onto something that does not belong in the field, then the brakes. A sound like something tearing. A high mechanical shriek that the canyon returned from 3 directions. The locomotive shuddering visibly along its entire length as the brake shoes hit the wheels. The freight cars behind it, compressing and jolting forward in sequence. The smoke went white and thick. The locomotive slid. It stopped 31 feet from where they were standing. The steam release came first, a hissing pressure exhaust from the boiler relief valve, loud and sustained, the kind of sound that fills a canyon and takes several seconds to dissipate. Then the engineer's head appeared from the cab window, a red-faced man in his 50s with his cap pushed back, and an expression that combined fury and relief in the specific proportion of a man who has just done something he did not think he could do. "Get off the track," he shouted, the words echoing off the canyon walls and returning twice. Wei Chen looked at him steadily across 31 feet of rail. He did not get off the track. The engineer's expression shifted from fury to something he had not prepared an expression for. The second man appeared at the cab, the fireman, younger, in work denims, looking at the two figures on the approach timber with the specific expression of a man who has no protocol for this situation. Then the conductor appeared. He came from the first passenger car. This was a mixed freight with 2 passenger cars at the rear. The schedule notation Wei Chen had read in the station log. The conductor was a compact man, approximately 45, with a gray uniform coat buttoned to the collar despite the morning cold, and a watch chain at his breast pocket, in a manner that projected authority with the automatic confidence of a man who enforced rules for a living and believed rules were rational. His name, printed on the brass tag at his lapel, was F. Daly. He walked the length of the stopped train at a pace that was not quite running, but was faster than walking, his boots on the gravel ballast, making a steady crunching sound audible above the steam release. He stopped on the embankment above the approach timber, 4 feet above Wei Chen's eye level, and looked down at them. "What in God's name are you doing on this bridge?" he said. "Showing you something," Corrigan said. Corrigan reached into his coat pocket and produced the Huntington Memorandum, the company's own document, dated August 3rd, 1872, on company letterhead, in the hand of Company District Engineer Thomas Halley, addressed to Company Vice President Collis Huntington, with the handwritten annotation in the margin and the dated signature beneath it, and held it up toward Daly. Daly looked at him for a moment, with the expression of a man being handed something by someone he has not yet classified, then stepped down from the embankment onto the approach timber and took the document. He read it with the held stillness of a man reading a thing he does not want to be reading, his eyes moving down the page without stopping, the steam release still hissing behind him, the river below. He reached the bottom. He read it again from the top. Wei Chen watched Daly's face move through something in the interval between the first reading and the second that could not precisely be called recognition, because recognition implies surprise. And what moved across Daly's face was more complicated than surprise. It was the expression of a man encountering the explanation for something he has observed without explanation for a long time. He lowered the document slowly. "The deflection on this bridge," Daly said. "I've crossed it 4 times a week for 6 years. I've reported the center span deflection to the district office 3 times. He looked at the trestle extending out over the canyon from where they stood, the timber joints, the iron anchor plates, the exact geometry of a structure he had crossed on a train 1,248 times without ever knowing what was inside its bolts. He looked at the memorandum in his hand. "They told me it was within acceptable parameters," he said, not bitterly. Flatly, the way a man states a fact whose implications he is still processing. Wei Chen reached into the tin box and produced the hand-drawn map with the 23 bridge locations marked in red ink, and the hollow bolt counts, written beside each one in the precise hand of a lathe operator who understood that the record had to survive him. He put his finger on the Black Bear Bridge location without speaking. Daly looked at the number beside it. 34, he said. Wei Chen told him the rest in 6 minutes. Standing on the approach timber of the Black Bear Bridge with the northbound freight stopped behind Daly and the river running 74 feet below, and the morning light coming harder now off the canyon walls. He told him about the bolt in his hand at 5:40 yesterday morning and the 12-mile walk in the dark and the tin box and the 47 names on the list and the 17 years between the Huntington Memorandum and this morning. He told him in the same manner he had told Corrigan at 4:30 a.m. On a dark road, fast, precise, no adjectives, the way he counted meal portions. Daly listened without interrupting, which Wei Chen noted, because men who interrupt are men still composing their objection, and men who do not interrupt are men crossing from one position to another and using the listening time to complete the crossing. Daly crossed. When Wei Chen finished, Daly looked at the hollow bolt that Wei Chen produced from his coat pocket. The original bolt, the one from yesterday morning, the one that had started everything, and turned it over in his hand the way Wei Chen had turned it over 43 times on the bridge deck the morning before. He pressed his thumb against the threaded end. The metal gave. "I need to speak to my telegraph operator," Daly said. He said it carefully, each word placed individually, the way a man speaks when he is constructing something precise out of language. He handed the hollow bolt back to Wei Chen. He kept the Huntington Memorandum. "I'm going to walk back to the train and speak to my telegraph operator," he said. "I would ask you to remain where you are." He looked at the tin box under Wei Chen's arm. "All of it stays with you." Wei Chen looked at him. "We're not leaving the bridge," Wei Chen said. Daly looked at the bridge beneath his own feet. The approach timber, the trestle extending out over the open canyon, the 34 hollow bolts he now knew were in the primary truss load-bearing structure somewhere below him. He looked at the Huntington Memorandum in his hand. He looked at the 2 men who had stood here specifically, so that he would have to stop and so that this conversation would have to happen. "No," he said quietly. "I wouldn't imagine you would be." He was gone for 9 minutes. 9 minutes in which Wei Chen and Corrigan stood on the approach timber without speaking, the steam release cycling on and off as the boiler vented pressure, the river noise constant and cold below. At 6:59 a.m., Daly returned on foot from the first passenger car. He walked the length of the train at the same pace as before, steady on the gravel ballast. His expression now settled into something new. Not the authority expression he had arrived with, but something deliberate and quieter. He stopped at the embankment above the approach timber. He held 2 items in his right hand, the Huntington Memorandum and a telegraph message form. Narrow yellow paper, the perforated edge of a fresh transmission from the train's wire equipment. The message form was face down. He looked at Wei Chen, he looked at Corrigan, he looked at the message form in his hand. He turned it face up. The message was from Sacramento Central Pacific Dispatch, timed at 6:54 a.m., addressed to Conductor F. Daly, Northbound Freight 7, current position Feather River Canyon. It read, 2 individuals at Black Bear approach. 1 Chinese male, 1 dismissed company employee, James R. Corrigan, are in possession of company documents obtained unlawfully. You are directed under company authority to detain both individuals and return them under supervision to Oroville Station for transfer to company security personnel, currently en route from Sacramento. Do not allow documents to leave your custody. Acknowledge receipt. Daly stood on the embankment above them and held the message in one hand and the Huntington Memorandum in the other, a document from 1872 and a document from 6 minutes ago, one signed by a vice president who had chosen $340,000 over the lives of the people crossing his bridges, and one signed by the office of that same company 17 years later, still choosing. The locomotive vented steam behind him. The river ran below. Frank Daly looked at both documents for a long time. He put the dispatch message in his coat pocket. Frank Daly folded the Sacramento dispatch message along its center crease and put it in his coat pocket and buttoned the pocket closed. He looked at Wei Chen. He looked at Corrigan. He looked at the Huntington Memorandum in his hand, then at the trestle extending out over the Feather River Canyon in the morning light, then back at the 2 men on the approach timber who had stood here at 6:40 a.m. On a bridge they both understood and let a 98,000-pound locomotive brake to a stop 31 feet from their chests rather than move out of the way, because moving out of the way was the only thing that would have let the company pretend this morning had not happened. He put the Huntington Memorandum in his inside coat pocket beside the dispatch message. He climbed down from the embankment onto the approach timber and stood beside them. There is a maintenance locomotive at the Oroville South Yard, he said. It runs the inspection track daily at 7:15. A man in my position can redirect it. He did not look at them when he said it. He looked at the bridge. Oroville to Sacramento is 4 hours. The maintenance locomotive left the Oroville South Yard at 7:22 a.m., 7 minutes late, because Daly had needed 7 minutes to make 2 conversations happen. One with the yard foreman, who asked no questions, because Daly asked him not to, and one with his own telegraph operator, who sent a message that was not to Sacramento. It was to a San Francisco attorney named Gerald Mott, whose name Corrigan had written on the back of a meal ticket from Wei Chen's apron pocket in pencil, pressing the ticket against his knee on the approach timber, while Daly was gone for his 9 minutes. Corrigan had retained Mott once before in 1887, when he was dismissed. A preliminary consultation that had not proceeded because Corrigan's documentation at that time was an engineer's internal report marked reviewed and closed, which was not, as Mott had explained, the same as evidence. The telegraph message that left Oroville at 7:19 a.m. was 3 sentences. Documents obtained. Federal filing today. Meet Sacramento Courthouse 1 p.m. The locomotive cleared the Oroville yard limits at 7:22 and accelerated south. They were on it. The maintenance locomotive did not cross the Black Bear Bridge. It ran the East Bank inspection track, a single rail maintenance line that ran parallel to the main track through the Feather River Canyon at a distance of 40 feet from the primary rail, separated from it by the canyon wall, and crossed the river at the Pulga Lower Bridge, a simple timber deck crossing at river level, uninspected since 1884. Structurally unrelated to the trestle above, Wei Chen noted this bridge as they crossed it at 7:31 a.m. at 15 miles per hour. The narrow timber span flexing perceptibly under the locomotive's weight. He said nothing about it. He was keeping a list in his meal notebook in Chinese of every bridge on the Feather River Canyon section that they passed. He had noted 11 by the time they reached the valley floor. They transferred to the southbound passenger at Marysville at 9:14 a.m. A Central Pacific train, standard service, Wei Chen's own line. The conductor on the Marysville southbound was a man named Porter, who had served Wei Chen coffee on the platform at Marysville 3 times and did not recognize him out of context, which was the usual condition of being a cook, recognized within the kitchen, invisible outside it. Wei Chen sat in the third passenger car with the tin box on his lap and watched the valley floor go past, flat, bright, warm already at 9 in the morning. The Sierra Nevada receding behind them in the east, Sacramento growing ahead in the west. Corrigan sat across from him and said almost nothing for the entire journey, which was, Wei Chen understood, not silence born of having nothing to say, but silence born of having too much to say and needing to save it for the right room. The right room was 4 hours away. Gerald Mott was waiting at the Sacramento station platform at 1:07 p.m. He was 61 years old, a small man in a dark suit, with the deliberate economy of movement of someone who had spent decades understanding that the law moved slowly and that the way to work within it was to never waste a step. He shook Corrigan's hand. He looked at Wei Chen. He looked at the tin box. He asked no questions on the platform. They walked 7 blocks to the United States District Court building on 7th Street, arriving at 1:19 p.m., and entered through the public door. And Mott led them to the clerk's filing office on the 2nd floor, and they sat at a table in a room that smelled of paper and ink and old wood, and Mott opened the tin box and read every document inside it in order without speaking. The only sounds in the room, the clock on the wall and the occasional street noise from below. He read for 31 minutes. He closed the tin and placed both hands flat on the lid. He said, "This is sufficient." The filing took 2 hours and 40 minutes. A federal complaint against the Central Pacific Railroad Company alleging willful concealment of known structural deficiencies in public infrastructure, material negligence, and fraudulent certification of safety inspections, supported by 14 primary documents, including the Huntington Memorandum, the Bolt Position Map, the Letter of Explanation from the 47-man group, and the complete list of 23 affected bridge sites, with individual hollow bolt counts. Mott filed at 2:14 p.m. on March 15, 1889. At 2:16 p.m., simultaneously, by prior arrangement Mott had made in the 2 hours between the Oroville Telegraph and the Sacramento Courthouse, a certified copy of the Huntington Memorandum and the Bolt Position Map arrived at the Associated Press office on Market Street in San Francisco, hand-delivered by Mott's clerk, who had left Sacramento by the noon southbound, with the copies in a sealed envelope. The Associated Press ran the story on the wire at 4:45 p.m. Pacific Time. The company could not suppress what was already moving. Central Pacific Railroad filed an emergency legal motion to seal the documents at 6:30 p.m. on March 15th. The motion was denied at 9:15 a.m. on March 16th. The same morning, the federal district judge issued a temporary restraining order requiring the suspension of all passenger and freight traffic across the 23 bridge sites listed in the complaint pending structural inspection by independent engineers, not employed by or contracted to the Central Pacific Railroad. The 23 bridges were closed within 72 hours. 14 of them, upon independent inspection, showed compromised load-bearing bolt connections consistent with the bolt position map in the filing. The other 9 showed evidence of prior hollow bolt installation with secondary solid bolt replacement, repairs that had been made quietly between inspection dates, with no records filed, in the years since the Huntington Memorandum. The company had known and had fixed some and had filed no report. The independent structural investigation ran for 18 months. It covered not just the Sacramento to Reno segment, but the full Central Pacific Main Line in 3 sections, employing 11 engineers working simultaneously, with federal marshals present at every inspection to prevent interference. The final cost of full bolt replacement across all affected structures, $412,000, paid by court order, plus $87,000 in inspection costs. The amount the company had owed its Chinese workers since 1867, as stated in the tin box letter and verified against company payroll records subpoenaed by the court, $214,000. The men who had drilled the bolts hollow had extracted their debt from the structure and compounded it with interest in iron. The court judgment, delivered February 9, 1891, noted this arithmetic in its closing paragraph. It was the first time a federal court had used the word proportion to describe an act of industrial sabotage. It was not inaccurate. The 47 names on the list in the tin box were entered into the federal court record on November 4th, 1889, as part of the evidentiary filing authenticating the origin of the documents. They were entered in the order they appeared on the original list, in the handwriting of the filing clerk, in ink that would not fade. Number 11, Liang Fushan, lathe operator, Sierra Nevada Crossing, 1865 to 1869. Number 19, Chen Baolin, lathe operator, Sierra Nevada Crossing, 1865 to 1869. Each name accompanied by a single descriptor: the occupation, the years, the segment. No biography, no photograph. No account of what it had cost each man to drive a drill bit into a bolt he had made correctly and make it wrong with intent and live with that knowledge for the rest of his life, crossing the same bridges on the same trains, listening to the same shudder at the center span, carrying the same arithmetic. Wei Chen read the printed record in Mott's office when the clerk brought the certified copy. He read his uncle's name twice. He closed the file and did not open it again. Howard Sims at Polga Station filed his own affidavit on March 20th, 1889, documenting the 5:43 a.m. stop order transmission, the content of the Huntington Memorandum as transcribed in the station log, and the 5:51 a.m. telephone call from Sacramento that he had not answered. He was dismissed by the Central Pacific Railroad on March 22nd. He was hired by the Federal District Court as a communication specialist on March 25th, a position he held for 11 years. James Corrigan's engineering license, revoked upon his 1887 dismissal, was reinstated by the State Board on June 1st, 1889, with a formal notation in the board's record that the 1887 dismissal had been consistent with company directive and inconsistent with professional fact. He testified in the federal investigation for 37 days across 14 months. He never worked for a railroad again. Frank Daly was not disciplined by the Central Pacific Railroad. The company's internal review of the March 15th incident listed his actions as judgment exercised under field conditions with incomplete information. He remained a conductor on the Feather River Line for 9 more years. In 1898, he gave a single interview to a Sacramento newspaper, in which he was asked why he put the dispatch message in his pocket. He said, "I had a document from 1872 in one hand and a document from that morning in the other, and they were both from the same company, and only one of them told me the truth." The interviewer asked which one. Daly said he assumed the interviewer knew. The interview was published on page 7. Wei Chen returned to the commissary car on February 3, 1890, 11 months after he had pulled a bolt from the Black Bear Bridge in the early morning and felt something wrong the instant the iron left the timber. The bridge itself had been closed since March 16th and was reopened on September 4th, 1889. After full bolt replacement verified by independent engineering inspection. Wei Chen crossed it on his first ride back at 5:40 a.m., the same hour, the same light, the same shutter at the center span that he had felt 300 times before, reduced now by a measurable fraction, because the truss connections held the way they were supposed to hold. Solid iron and solid iron. Nothing hollow in the primary load path for the first time in 23 years. He felt the difference. He stood at the dining car window with a tin cup and watched the trestle pass and felt the bridge under him, its real weight, its actual strength, what it was when it was what it was supposed to be. And then it was behind him. And the canyon opened south into the morning valley, and he carried his coffee back to the stove. In a courthouse evidence room in Sacramento, in a numbered box on a labeled shelf, in a locked cabinet in a room that smelled of paper and old wood, a single hollow bolt sat on a folded piece of documentation noting its origin, the date of its recovery, and the case number of the federal proceedings it had initiated. It weighed almost nothing,